Now let's move on to a new resolution. The police are getting challenged in so many quarters. The one reliable support they have are from the unions that so many police belong to, but it's a relationship that has become controversial in itself as it's perceived over the last several months. So the resolution we're debating, and you are first up for this one, Jason Johnson, police unions do more harm than good. Jason, are you a yes or no on that one?
I'm a no with one relatively small caveat, which I'll address. Police unions do three principal things. First off, they're social. They allow police officers to decompress together in a social environment, get their families together, and certainly I don't think anyone argues against that. They also are collective bargaining units. So they do negotiate on behalf of members of police departments, police officers. They negotiate with the municipalities that employ police officers and form work contracts, collective bargaining agreements. And third, they push for legislation. They push for or against legislation. So in their role as advocates for and collective bargaining for their membership, the vast majority of these unions simply are negotiating for better wages, salaries, working conditions. They're negotiating with municipalities. So any collective bargaining agreements they have are struck with the municipalities. They're not things that are just drafted by the union and the municipalities are stuck with them. They are bargains in every sense of the word. And so they shouldn't be scapegoated as contributing to problems in law enforcement. With respect to their legislative work, there are 16 states in the United States that have some form of law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights that in many cases were championed by these unions. But again, this is legislative action that's taken by legislative bodies in states. They do so voluntarily. There is a political check on them, and it's not the union's fault if people now feel that those bills of rights that protect procedural rights only for law enforcement officers are all of a sudden unpopular. The caveat I'll give you where I think there is a problem is when collective bargaining agreements overly involve themselves in the discipline process and tie the hands of law enforcement executives and don't allow them to take appropriate disciplinary action. That is the one caveat where I think we need to do better with unions.
Thank you, Jason. Our next speaker on this one is Rafael Mangual. Rafael, on the resolution, police unions do more harm than good. Are you a yes or a no?
I'm a no, simply because I just don't think there's enough evidence to say that. Now, you should understand that as someone who's generally skeptical of public sector unions, I'm somewhat more ambivalent about this question than some of the others before us. But I think what we have to ask ourselves with respect to this particular resolution, as well as the others for that matter, is why this issue has come to the fore. And I think that the answer to that is that there is an argument that is risen to the fore, and that argument goes as follows, which is, as Jason kind of noted, police unions have been instrumental in bargaining for provisions in collective bargaining agreements that functionally raise the transaction costs of disciplining police officers when they misbehave beyond the point of reasonableness. And I think that this is certainly a problem. But it's also important for us to understand why unions so closely guard the employment security of their members. And I think the reason is that as a policing career develops, you develop a set of skills as a cop that isn't necessarily obviously translatable into another line of work. And police officer pay is not especially high. Much of it is backlogged through pension programs. And so I think one of the things that we ought to be thinking about is how we can encourage union leaders to ease up on some of these specific provisions, such as by raising officer pay at the front end, even if that means maybe reducing pension payments. Because if you spend 8 years, as a cop and you get fired, that can be extremely, extremely detrimental. And so, I also think that, there is some good that they do. Jason sort of hinted at some of the legislation. To the extent that that gives police officers the competence they need to proactively do their jobs well, I think that is a good. I'm open to being convinced otherwise, that the balance comes out in the other way. But for now, I say no.
Thank you, Rafael. Next up is Sue Rahr. Sue, resolution again, police unions do more harm than good. Are you yes or no?
I'm a no, but unions serve an important function for employees, especially employees in a dangerous working environment where funding is limited. There needs to be strong advocacy for safety and reasonable pay. In my experience, the unions get blamed for what elected officials do. The elected officials bow too easily, in my opinion, to unions' political pressure. The union is playing an advocacy role. The elected officials need to play their stewardship role and strike a balance between the interests of the community and the interest of the members and their employment rights. Because tough on crime has been such a popular political position, unions have been able to use it to their advantage. They can threaten politicians who don't who don't support union-backed legislation by labeling them soft on crime. And that threat has been very effective for the last 50 years. It still works well in the most egregious misbehavior, even in the very blue state of Washington. Unions do what unions are supposed to do. Elected officials need to begin challenging that. All the rights, processes, and procedures unions use to protect officers are encoded in local laws and procedures, just as Jason has said. I think that in Washington state, we have binding arbitration that allows a civilian arbitrator to order a police chief to put an officer that was fired for egregious misconduct right back on the street. When I was sheriff, this infuriated me, but it was and it still is the law in the state of Washington. The laws need to be changed and the politicians need to stand up to the pressure.
Thank you, Sue. Our fourth opening statement on the motion, police unions do more harm than good. Vikrant, Reddy? Vikrant, the screen is yours.
Well, much like Ralph, I'm generally a skeptic of public sector unions, but I would extend that to police unions also. I'm a yes on this question. You know, unions, they argue for reduced accountability for their members. That happens whether it's a police union or it's not a police union. That's what they're pushing for. That's why you see things like in Austin, Texas, where I come from, a really curious rule that says that after an allegation of police misconduct, the officer is allowed to review his video before speaking to an investigator. That's a really bizarre rule. It means that you get to come up with some kind of a story that's consistent with what everybody's going to see on the screen before you even speak with the investigator. Rules like that get bargained for by the unions. You know, there was actually a case in 2003 in Florida that gave collective bargaining rights to sheriff's deputies. In the immediate aftermath of this decision to give collective bargaining rights to these sheriff's deputies, allegations of police misconduct went up 40%. Now, I'm just citing one study in one state, but we know what's happening here. What's happening here is that the unions are collective bargaining, and they're bargaining for reductions in accountability. I will even note that police unions will come forward and oppose police reform ideas that come from other police officers. A few years ago, the Police Executive Research Forum put out a set of guidelines on the use of force. And all this thing said was that there are standards set by law, but there are best practices. You can go above and beyond the law, and police officers ought to stick to these. And nevertheless, the police unions opposed this document. It was drafted by cops for cops. As a closing note, I'll say I gave a kind of middle of the road answer on whether or not we should defund the police. I can give a firm answer that we should defund the police unions.
All right. Thanks very much. Combining two of our resolutions. All right. We are 3 no's and 1 yes on whether police unions do more harm than good. That leaves it now to Paul Butler. Paul Butler, on the resolution, are you a yes or a no?
I'm neither. I'm a oh, hell yes.
Okay.
A pack of rabid animals. That's how the president of the Philly Police Union described activists in Black Lives Matter. They were protesting a cop who had shot Black suspects in the back on 2 separate occasions. When that cop finally got suspended for his brutality, the police union had a fundraiser for him. Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke got fired for shooting 16 bullets into the back of Laquan McDonald. The Chicago Fraternal Order of Police then hired him to be a janitor at their headquarters. That cop was subsequently convicted of murder. Tamir Rice, 12-year-old kid, got killed by a Cleveland police officer. The president of the Miami Fraternal Order of Police tweeted, "Act like a thug, you'll be treated like a thug." After cops in Atlanta and New York were disciplined for police brutality, the head of the Florida Police Union tweeted, "We're hot in Florida. Police reform is about transparency and accountability. Police unions fight those every step of the way. They block transparency by fighting to have the disciplinary records of cops who've been fired for misconduct kept secret. They fight accountability by seeking special protections and privileges for police officers who have killed or beat up, falsely arrested the people who they're supposed to serve and protect." So I agree with my debaters who say that there's nothing wrong with any worker, including a police officer, organizing for better working conditions or more pay. Police unions should not be allowed to bargain for things like the use of deadly force or hiding the disciplinary records of bad apple cops.
Thank you, Paul Butler. All right, we've just heard opening arguments on the resolution, police unions do more harm than good, and now we're going to give our debaters a chance to respond to one another and take some questions from me. All right, so let's discuss what we've just heard, and I want to go to you, Jason Johnson, not just because you spoke first, but because you did make a distinction, the distinction that Paul Butler just mentioned between police having basically labor protection in terms of salary, working conditions, things like that. You made an exception for, you said, well, the one place I don't think the unions are always conducting their business in the correct way is when it comes to their interaction, their involvement with disciplinary measures. You kind of put that at the tail as like not the main thing that the union is about. All four of the other debaters really did make the point that that's the main problem with the union, that's a big problem, that's a main thing, and it's having far-reaching effects. The fact that some police unions are involved in lobbying legislators who set the laws or in setting local regulations, and that there's an impulse to protect one's own, and that's a big deal. So I want to go back to you as the first speaker in that round to have you respond to the weight that your opponents are giving to that part of the story.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that I think that is the area in which police unions, the work of police unions can be more harmful than helpful, is when there's an overemphasis on collective bargaining for disciplinary due process, and in other ways restraining the ability of their executives, their police chiefs or their sheriffs, from administering discipline. Police unions are part of the process. They're part of the democratic process. So they have a seat at the table, just like the community does, just like the leadership in any jurisdiction, and how the police department or sheriff's office is and should be run. So to shut them out of that seems completely undemocratic. To say that they can't lobby legislators to pass laws that are helpful to them and their membership, it's the same thing that the ACLU does, that any organization does, is that they use the democratic process to improve things for their members. And that's all that unions do. Now, over time, jurisdictions have, sometimes for the purposes that are good for the employing municipality, have made concessions with the unions that allow collective bargaining agreements to be filled with things that are not monetary in nature, have nothing to do with salary and benefits, have everything to do with restraining the ability of executives to discipline police officers. But in many cases, those have been put in there at the behest of the municipalities because they don't want to pay raises or other things, make improvements to benefits. They would rather include these non-monetary issues that have historically been less important to the municipalities. And now we get to a point in history where there's a lot of scrutiny on these things, and all of the municipal leaders are sort of walking away from it and blaming it on the unions, when really the unions just came to the table to negotiate, and they got the best deal they could for their members. So I think there's something just that kind of stinks about putting this at the feet of the unions, when in most cases these were things that were pushed by the municipal leaders.
Rafael, your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I think we can say that it is almost an unalloyed harm, negative, that these unions often are successful in being able to negotiate for these provisions that essentially prevent executives from disciplining rogue officers. And I think that's a real problem. But however, one of the reasons I don't say that we can say for sure that police unions do more harm than good is that the universe in which those provisions come to bear is actually really small, right? Again, the reason we're talking about this is because we had these viral incidents of alleged police misconduct. But the reality is that police use of force is extremely rare in the United States across jurisdictions, whether those jurisdictions have police departments that are unionized or not. More than 99% of arrests affected in the United States go off without a hitch, which is to say that they go off without any significant amount of force being used by police at all. And even in the cases in which police do use force, 98% of the time, that force does not result in any measurable injury to the suspect. And so, I think it's natural for us to worry about these really problematic events, but we do have to sort of, I think, zoom out and understand how rare they really are. And when we do that, I think what we see is that while this is a certainly negative aspect of police unionization, it's brought to bear in a relatively small number of cases, given the overall volume of police activity in the United States, which produces so many goods.
So to take that point, to Vikrant, what you're arguing is that the incidents of police using force, which is where this question of having control over discipline comes into play, is really, really small. It's really quite, on the scale of things, a very minor part of what police do most of the time in most interactions with people. Vikrant, does that argument soften in any way your concern about police having this power?
No, not in the slightest. I'd say two things about that. First of all, I agree with Rafael that the uses of force and abuses of force are small relative to everything that police officers do. But nevertheless, when they happen, there should be discipline whenever they're bad. The police unions are arguing for ways to reduce that kind of accountability. That's just clear. The second thing I would say is that even if it's not a use of force, there are all kinds of things that could constitute police misconduct for which police unions, once again, they are in a position to argue for reduced accountability for their members. I'll give just one really small example. Professor Butler mentioned the Tamir Rice situation. I should be more clear. She mentioned the Tamir Rice killing in Cleveland.
Tragedy, murder, one of those.
And Professor Butler mentioned that something very ugly was said by a police union leader in Miami. But forget the ugly thing that was said. What about the ugly thing that was done? The police officer who shot Tamir Rice had a record. He had been fired from a previous job in a different police department, and he hid that from the Cleveland Police Department when he was hired. He was fired for hiding this, for withholding this information. And the police union has stepped forward to defend him in court because that's what they do. They step forward to defend the absolute worst of their membership. That's the job. That's a big part of why they're a huge problem if we're looking for police reform.
So you were in the position that you described where you wanted to exert discipline against officers under your command, and the union rules wouldn't let you do that, and you were frustrated. But you say, let's not blame that on the union, let's blame that on the legislature. But as Jason mentioned at the beginning, unions work on legislation. Would you want to bar unions from having that right to push legislation?
No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is our elected officials need to grow a backbone. That's where the problem is. It's like saying we're going to do criminal justice reform by getting rid of defense attorneys. Unions have a necessary and important role, and especially in a profession that has so many dangers in it. What I'm saying, and I can't believe so much of my career I fought against the union, but I'm going to agree with Jason on this. We have seen municipalities all over the country try to save money in wage increases by conceding to all kinds of procedural things. So I'm not saying we need to get rid of unions, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't lobby, but we need our elected officials to take responsibility for the stewardship of the welfare of the community and not bow to the union's pressure.
Paul Butler.
And not sell it so that they can pay lower wages.
Paul, I see you shaking your head on that.
Yeah, because Sue says that lawmakers need to grow a backbone. Respectfully, some of my fellow debaters here need to grow a backbone. The resolution is police unions do more harm than good. We're not talking about lawmakers, so I don't understand why people are passing the buck. So people know that there have been arrests during these protests. Some of the people who have been arrested are agitators, right-wing agitators who are trying to give the nonviolent protesters a bad name, people like the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. I guess you could ask, do the Proud Boys and Boogaloo Boys do more harm than good? It sounds like some of the debaters would say, well, no, because they don't make the law. Only the people who make the laws who should be held responsible. I think that police unions should be held responsible for the damage that they do to our civil society. Rafael said that it's just a minor, well, not a minor problem, but a rare problem, people being subject to violence by police. Not if you look at the number of people who, well, look at statistics. 1,000 Black men and boys will be killed by the police. 1 in 1,000. So I guess you could say to Tamir Rice or Michael Brown or Eric Garner, well, it doesn't happen to most Black men. The fact that it happens as frequently as that is a problem. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, at least Vic was consistent. He says he's skeptical of public employee unions, and he's also skeptical of police unions. I'm curious about why Rafael is skeptical about most police unions when it comes to people who have the power to kill, to beat you up, to arrest you, to change your life in a minute. Then he's not as sure. Well, maybe those people who have all that power, maybe they should be allowed to organize. I don't get that distinction. It doesn't make sense to me.
All right, I want to let Rafael respond to that, but I want to point out that Rafael did not say that violent incidents were minor. I used that term, and I'm withdrawing it. What he was really saying was that statistically it was a small part of the number of interactions. So let's take minor off the table.
Just to be clear, and I don't think he said that, and I'm sure he doesn't
he didn't say
mean that. So I also corrected. He said that they were rare, not that they're minor, but that they're rare.
Yeah.
Right,
Rafael.
right, and they are statistically rare. And yes, while it is true that 1 in 1,000 Black men, that the risk of being killed by police for Black men is about 1 in 1,000. I think it's important.
Not the risk, but the actual number, 1 in 1,000. I think all Black men risk being killed. 1 in 1,000 will be killed.
With respect, I believe that you're referring to a study in the National Academy of Sciences, in the Annals of the National Academy of Sciences, which put the odds of dying at the hands of police for Black men at 1 in 1,000. That was a statement of odds, not that 1 in 1,000 Black men would be killed by police. But if you contrast that with the odds of all Americans being killed by general gun assault, those odds are dramatically higher at 1 in 298. When you consider the fact that Black men are more than 10 times more likely than their white counterparts to be the victim of a homicide, I think it becomes very clear that the risk of death at the hands of police is far lower than of homicide generally, and that higher risk of homicide generally explains why the risk of of Black men being killed by police is so much higher, because that influences how police deploy their resources, in response to those areas of high crime, which then manifests itself in more interactions. But I do think it's important to say that I did not say that police unions are good. The question before us is whether they do more harm than good. And I don't have to buy into public sector unions or police unions specifically to come to the answer that I did. Again, I just think that when you consider the scope of the cases in which, this specific problem that police unions have caused with respect to these provisions in collective bargaining agreements, I do think it's a relatively small part of what police do. I do think it's a significant problem. I think I've been very clear about that. But again, that does not mean that on balance, on net, the harm that is done outweighs the potential good. I just haven't heard enough evidence to say otherwise.
Vikrant, you haven't been in part of the conversation for a while now. Would you like to jump in? And if not, I can go to Jason, because it looks like he is ready to go. Jason, why don't we go to you, and then I'll come back to you, Vikrant.
Yeah, two things. First off, the police unions don't do anything with respect to collective bargaining agreements or supporting or opposing legislation that implicates in any way the criminal responsibility or criminal system that applies to police officers when they've used force. So if a police officer violates the criminal law and the use of force, nothing that union can do in any of their power extends in any way to that, nor does it cover civil liability for police officers. We have to remember this is simply in the employment context. That's it. It governs the relationship between the employer and the employee, just like any other union. The other thing I would point out, and partially in response to something Vikrant said about, officers have to be held accountable if they use excessive force. Well, I think we all agree with that. The problem is that because of the nature of the work that police officers do, their work is increasingly in the public space. They're on videotape, there are viral videos of police actions, and people are paying a lot more attention to it. Very easy for elected officials and even police chiefs to fall into the trap of treating very harshly police officers, even when they've done nothing wrong. They get treated very harshly because of the public backlash on the actions. There's a very, very short attention span of the public on these policing issues. Many members of the public pay zero attention to the facts. They see a viral video and they assign blame to it and they're ready to move on to the next one. The work of unions, in part, is to protect law enforcement officers from the political heat that comes with being involved in a controversial incident and making sure that the employer is actually looking at the facts and treating that employee with due process. There's nothing any union can do to get a police officer out of trouble when they've done something wrong. There simply is not. And I've seen some really collective bargaining agreements that go very, very far. At the end of the day, if the cop has done something wrong and it can be proven, there can be accountability.
Jason, are you saying that we should not be trusting what the videos seem to say?
No, you shouldn't. The video is one piece of evidence. You can't just look at a video and decide you know what happened. That's a trap that people fall into. And that's why, that's partly why unions exist, is because they have to ensure that their members are being treated fairly and with due process. That's it. That's all they're asking for is due process. Now, if an employee, and I know Professor Butler is probably waiting to say this, if an employer, a law enforcement employer, fails to properly investigate a use of force or fails to take proper action, that's on the agency. That's not on the union. Unions cannot stop the discipline from happening. I've worked in jurisdictions with very strong unions on both the labor and management side. I know it can be done. You have to actually follow through and follow the procedural steps that are required.
Vikrant, I want to give you the last word again, but because of that, I think Paul wants to say something, and I'll let Paul speak, and then I'll come to you, Vikrant. And Paul, if I'm wrong, go ahead, go for it.
No, well, there was a statement about videotapes and maybe we shouldn't believe them. I think that we can believe our own eyes when we see police in Minneapolis put their knee on George Floyd's neck and strangle him to death. I think that one of the reasons that we're having this national reckoning on race is that all over the country, Americans have seen with their own eyes the violence and brutality of policing in communities of color.
Vikrant, last word from you.
Well, I'll just briefly agree with Jason on his point about cameras. Any sports fan knows that you can't just say, well, we have instant replay, we've got it all figured out. But on a more important point, I really disagree with Jason on this question about whether or not police unions can help their members evade accountability. Jason's argument was that, look, if they've done something wrong, they've done something wrong. They're not going to be able to get away from that as the process plays itself out. I question that. But even more importantly, what can happen on the front end? Again, I think about the police contract in Austin. So after 180 days, there's a 180-day rule. If a complaint is made against police officers after 180 days, it can't be investigated. It's got to happen within this time period. Beyond that, you're out of luck. You can negotiate for these rules on the front end to help the officer evade accountability on the back end later on.
Thank you, Vikrant. And that concludes our discussion of this question of whether police unions have done more harm than good.